Yeah, well, it's interesting. My father's full name is Leslie Francis Griffin. He always said, please don't call me Leslie, except his mother called him Leslie. And some of his better friends, guys like Tank Hayes and Oscar Reed, and all the people that grew up with him called him Leslie. And as he became a man and entered the ministry, he went by the name of L. Francis Griffin. So I'm Leslie Francis Griffin Jr. I'm the oldest, his oldest child. And, but growing up, people call me Skippy. Everyone knows me by that name. So I would be willing to bet there's some people who don't even, well, now that I've been speaking there, they probably know, but that was my name growing up. And as I became older, they just shortened it to Skip. But, I grew up in Farmville. I was there observing my father, and I participated in work with him, and especially voter registration work and NAACP work later in demonstrations and so forth. I attended the free schools, but afterwards I came back to Newton, Mass to finish high school. I was here for 2 years of the time that school was closed. I was out of school for the rest of the time. I thought that if, in order to go to Harvard or a place like that, I would probably be better served by finishing school in Newton, but I did attend the free schools. I have fond memories. I grew up in Farmville. That's home.
So, to me, as a museum educator here at the Moton Museum, and I know many community members here, Reverend Griffin is a legend. To us, it's mythical kind of figure, especially because a lot of us here have never had a chance to meet him. Would you mind just telling us a little bit about, what was he like, and what was his kind of inspiration to merge the worlds of kind of social justice and his own faith?
One of the people that knows him well there in town, there are others, but I think most of his buddies and some of the people who were there in the original phase of the movement had passed on and gone to be with their ancestors. But I would say of the people remaining, Reverend Samuel Williams probably has the best understanding. And I've heard him say, and he's right, that my father's call to the ministry, he felt that his faith had something to say and was relevant to his entire life, not just the part of life that dealt with individual sin. I mean, he also believed that while it's true individuals can sin and they need make right with God, as many preachers do, he also felt that governments and national governments, state governments, local governments, institutions could also sin, and that sin took the form of being unjust to the least of these, my brethren, or to discriminating against people based on color and their standing in life. I would say that he came under the influence early, and there are people who will say he came under the influence of Vernon Johns early. I think that's absolutely true. But there were other influences as well. Howard Thurman, to a certain but lesser degree, Mordecai Johnson. Adam Clayton Powell was only a few years older, and they crossed paths. And then my uncle, who pastored in Norfolk, Virginia, but who had previously worked with Reverend Tom Kilgore, they had organized the Black Baptists in North Carolina. And I would say that the Black Baptists have one of the more aggressive and organized programs for a long period of time in North Carolina. Tom Kilgore, who later went on to become the first Black to head up the American Baptist Association. And then he had contemporaries. James Cheek was actually a little younger, and taught at Virginia Union, was for a while the president of Shaw, and then went on to become president of Howard. They were all friends. Sam Proctor, Wyatt Walker. I remember as a young boy, before Reverend Walker joined SCLC, he would come to Farmville, or my daddy would go to Petersburg. So there was a network of preachers, and interestingly enough, many of them had fathers who had been ministers, so they knew each other from the time they were young boys. But he was always drawn to that aspect of the Bible, especially the Old Testament and the prophets, who focused on justice and treating the least of these fairly. And so that was the basis of his ministry.
What was it, if you're willing to share, what was it like kind of just growing up with Reverend Griffin Sr. being your father?
So I've had given speeches like this. I mean, some of the early memories are, some of those figures. I remember going out to Vernon John's, the store out there that he and his brother ran in Darlington Heights. And then he had a piece of land. And I remember being there, and it'd be sort of some of those preachers there, and they'd be discussing these issues. Sam Proctor, Jim Cheeks, one occasion Adam Clayton Powell. They would gather, and I would say, first of all, his commitment was to the ministry and to his understanding of the prophetic aspect of tradition. But he was first and foremost a man that read everything. So I was not aware that every one house wasn't similarly organized. He read books all the time, newspapers, and I would say, in a wide range of stuff, the philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, but even the existential philosophers, Sartre, Camus. It was a wide, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Buber, the social gospel. The biggest thing was his commitment to expanding the mind. His backing Barbara and the students when they walked out was an extension of his belief that education, along with faith, were two of the most powerful tools in advancing the race, but also in advancing the country. The biggest thing was in our dinner table, I remarked to people as from the time we were little, we were allowed to sit at the table when he would discuss things, and when people would come through, journalists or other preachers or activists who would come through, and my mother would prepare meals. We were, a lot of times people would send the children away. We were allowed to sit at the table. And as we got older and were able to follow and understand the conversation, we could participate. Our reason for not participating was trying to catch up with the conversation, because they were pretty deep conversations. But as you got older, you could start to piece together some of it. And then as we got even older, the three of us that were older, myself, my sister Naja, my sister Mignon, we would debate a subject, and the next night he would say, okay, come back tomorrow night prepared to debate the other side. And I said, but I don't agree with the other side. That's all right. I want you to prepare arguments for the other side. His belief was, though, that he wanted to make books, and he wanted education to be accessible to everyone. He felt it was the great equalizer.
Why do you think he let y'all stay? Do you think he just wanted y'all to be well-rounded?
Well, I think yes, but as I said, if there wasn't a race problem or race issue, I think in his heart of hearts, he would have found a school where he could have been on the faculty. He really enjoyed mixing it up, especially with students of all ages. And I've run into students who from Queens College and others who came there various summers to help out in Prince Edward, and they said they came prepared to engage with a country preacher and found an intellectual, and they just amazed at some of the conversations they had. And I would say that his commitment was to education, and he believed that people had much more capability than they were often tap into. And so he thought that he would measure people, and he would start having deeper conversations with you as soon as he felt you were prepared to handle the ideas. And he thought that the world would be transformed, not only by spirit, but by ideas. So he would say that there were two things. He believed in the word with a capital W, meaning God. In the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was God. And then he believed in words, period, with a small w. And together, he thought that was the transforming power for this country and for the world. And, he once gave me an article, and they were, talking about Barry Wall and Senator Byrd and some of the fellows, Crawford and Hanbury, that owned the Buffalo Shook. And they said they have money. Barry Wall has a newspaper, and all the Reverend Mr. Griffin has is his voice. And he would say, that's all you need, especially if the Lord is moving through you, inspiring you. You don't need anything but your voice. One of his favorite things he taught me, and I actually have used it in consulting. He said, if you read the book of Genesis, he said God spoke the world into existence. He didn't build it with a hammer and a nail and a saw and a pulley. He spoke the world into existence. So words have power. As a matter of fact, one of the ones he had me play around with, power, life, and death are in your tongue. But he felt that in order to influence the words that came through your mouth, you had to study the Bible and you had to read everything. You had to be prepared to argue and meet people. If they were philosophers, you had to be prepared to understand the philosophy. If they were historians, you had to be ready to deal with the history. Or if they were dealing with political science, then you had to be, you had to understand and engage with people on the level of their ideas as well.
Do you know about your father's work with the NAACP? And if so, would you mind just kind of elaborating some kind of when he got involved and what all he did?
Yeah, I don't know when he got involved. That's something, as far as I know, he was always involved. If you look at this sort of spiritually, and I don't mean just as a minister, you might say he was more of a kindred spirit because, he was an incredible speaker, preacher, and probably more in the, more like King and those inspirational and inspiring preachers. So one would think that he would have been a natural fit in SCLC, but one of the things he believed in was institutions and organizations. And his thing was that King was very much needed. That wasn't in debate, but that his part of the movement was based on charisma and spirit, and that he felt that the NAACP had a much stronger organizational base, that they had chapters, and that for a time up, when I was growing up and when the movement was certainly coming into fruition and really blossoming in the 50s and 60s, the NAACP had larger membership. And he felt that wherever you went in the South and even in the North, but certainly in the South, you'd likely to encounter NAACP chapter. And both he and my uncle were firm believers in creating institutions, much like what you all are trying to do there with Moden. He remained faithful to the NAACP because of their organizational reach, although, as I said, probably intellectually and spirit and in terms of his sort of natural tendency toward activism, he would have been more at home in SCLC. He was always a man that understood sources of power. And so out in Prospect, the Scots and in other parts of Prince Edward and all throughout Virginia, there were really strong NAACP chapters. And so his belief was make the organization even stronger, take advantage of its network of chapters and expand that. And then he also believed in the church, both as a force in people's everyday lives, as a way to influence and shape their moral and social character, but also that the church, he thought those were the two most important institutions. And the third network of institutions, although in his way of thinking a little bit behind because he didn't think they'd been as fully developed, was the historically Black colleges. And both he and my mother went to Shaw in Raleigh, and Reverend Williams, I think, went to Shaw as a result. I don't ever remember him not being affiliated with the NAACP. I think I was born into that.
Would you mind just talking a little bit? I mean, I find that people don't ask enough about your mother, Adelaide Griffin. I mean, would you mind speaking a little bit about?
Yeah, I mean, so my mother was trained as a teacher. I mean, she went to Shaw and she wanted to become a teacher. What many people don't know is that my mother was an incredible artist as well. I think my father, well, they both knew the Bible well. My mother was a deeply spiritual woman, and she read the Bible. But she was also deeply committed to the arts. And so she had one of the things, we would listen to Marian Anderson, we would listen to Roland Hayes, a singer that many people don't know about. We'd listen to Paul Robeson. But then when church people wasn't around, she'd also listen to Nat King Cole. Oh, she just loved Nat King Cole. And so she loved the arts. She'd listen to Beethoven and Bach. I remember once being at an event, the woman said, "Oh, that's Beethoven." And my mother said, "I don't think that's right. I think it's Bach." And it's a white woman, and she was certain that she was right. And I saw the woman sneak over and look at the thing, and actually my mother was right. So, and one incident, when we lived down, it was then Eli Street, and we lived down there in the house that was taken by eminent domain, along with many houses. There were three white females who came up and met my mother, and she would hold art classes on art history and take them through all the genres. Of course, they discovered that they were visiting her and that it was Reverend Griffin's wife, and they stopped her, and it really hurt her. But they actually came there, and my mother was running an informal tutorial service. She could sew, she could cook. She was just a kind of a Renaissance woman. And you're right, she taught a lot of young women in Prince Edward to sew, and she believed that you could take limited incomes and provide your family with many of the things that people now go to the stores to buy. She also liked the farmers. You know, a lot of ministers' wives would complain, saying they don't give you money. They bring you butter beans and corn and stuff in the. My mother, we would have mason jars lining the walls of the basement and the cabinets. She would, and she taught a lot of young women how to do canning with the old mason jars and stuff. So she never, I never heard her complain about not having anything. She would figure out how to stretch whatever it was that you had. She'd take a piece of cloth and turn it into a dress, or like many Black women, patches into quilts. You know, she just always made us believe that you could take limited supplies and whatever and make a bountiful life out of it. And I think that's the way she taught home ec, and later in that vocational school up there near the high school. That's just her belief. I never heard her complain about not having enough. What bothers me a little bit about is as we come together now, especially in this period of COVID and in the uncertainty that exists in the country. They were extraordinary people, but there were other extraordinary Black people, too numerous to name in Prince Edward. And I think that what I hope that you all try to do, and I hope that we shift a little bit our emphasis in the Black community. We tend to focus a lot on the tragedy and not on the triumph. I mean, one of the great stories that, you know, we kind of know, but we don't really talk about enough is the Black church is an institution, not just as a house of God, but as an institution being at the center of the community. And, you know, most of these Black churches, you know, they didn't, you guys know how to write grants and get programs funded. They know how to fry chicken, run baby contests, or Tom Thumb weddings. You know, Black churches were built with Black money and Black sweat equity. They didn't write grants. And so it's one of the great untold stories. And then people raised families and sent their children, not just my parents, but other people there in Prince Edward and throughout the South, sent their children to school, and they became teachers, and, you know, they served in the military. It's like, we need to talk more about the triumph, not just the tragedy. What's interesting is, you know, I would say, if I listen and I try to play them back in my mind, I would say I rarely heard my father lament and become fixated on the problems of racism. He, like King and many of those men and women, he was focused on a better world. You know, if you think about the passage in the Bible, I looked up and I saw a wheel and a wheel, or the promised land. You know, his focus was on the world to be, not the world that was. And I don't mean heaven. I mean, an earthly expansion of justice and mercy and commitment to community and commitment to your neighbor. And I rarely heard, you know, he said we want to end the system of segregation, but he had in mind a community where there were schools for all, high quality schools. He wasn't just concerned about schools for Black kids. He wanted real rigorous education for all of the kids in Prince Edward County. And so his focus was on creating a new world, the wheel in a wheel, you know, the promised land. He was always forward thinking about how we could, what a community might look like if we actually believed that we were all children of God.
Yeah, and you touch a very important point that kind of leads me to my next question. What, you know, when we think of kind of that era, we think of people like your father, we think of Vernon Johns, we think of Martin Luther King, but just, I guess through the years, just the Black church in particular is just kind of not, this is not the same as it once was. Would you agree with that to a certain extent?
Well, I think the Black church still plays a role. I think that the social justice aspect of it has been somewhat diminished. I still think it plays an important role. And I do think that it's important. Let me not sound as if I'm saying it's not important. I do think, you know, dealing with the moral fiber of a community and giving people values, I think that's important. But I would agree that the church focuses less on justice now and less on a community of brotherhood and sisterhood. I can remember my mother's practice was whenever anyone came to the house, she would always greet them as brother so-and-so. If your parent, you know, brother Townsend, sister Townsend, you know, and regardless of race. And my mother's commitment was to the body of Christ, and that anyone who was in the church or even not of the church was a part of that body, and that we were brothers and sisters in Christ. And that was the way she greeted people. And she meant it. I mean, that's the thing. It wasn't just, and so I do think that the notion of, you know, people have been, I think that there's a deliberate attempt by some to shift the emphasis away from focus on social justice and on the advancement of communities, and to focus primarily on individual salvation, you know.
Why do you think that is, if I can ask?
Because I think, you know, what is the passage? These are they who have come to turn the world upside down, or those who disturb Israel. You know, I think that, or, you know, it's like I think that, you know, there's I have been told, and I studied, you know, talked this over with a number of biblical scholars, that the slave masters actually used to take all of the passages out of the Bible that had to do with justice and rebellion and that kind of thing, and they only gave a version to the slaves that called for them to be obedient to their masters. Or so I think that there is real, that God intervenes in history, and he intervenes in history on behalf of those who are less fortunate, you know, or who are suffering. You know, I mean, you know, for a while, preachers, including Black preachers, didn't want to deal with the AIDS. But if you look at the Bible, many people in that era didn't want to deal with the lepers, you know, but Jesus, of course, did. And, you know, he was accused of being with the unclean. I think that the reason they do that is because there's power. It's undeniable that God is interested in justice, you know, and I think that, Mahalia Jackson and the other gospel singers, you know, sometimes I look back and wonder how I got over. Well, it's the Spirit. I mean, God, you know, Jesus dealt with the people who had their back up against the wall, you know, you know, you can just see this over and over again, you know. So I think that the success of the movement, yes, the NAACP, I'm going to sound as if I'm contradicting myself, but the NAACP was powerful, but you can't explain the success of the civil rights movement any other way than that the Spirit of the Lord was upon it. And you know, the thing when Barbara and the young people walked out, that sermon, the prophecy of equality, when he speak, you know, every mountain shall be made low, the valleys shall be lifted up, you know. the crooked places made straight, the rough places made smooth. I mean, and that wasn't just, you know, physically. I mean, that's God intervening in history. That's a frightening thing, you know. They would much rather have you believe that you're not doing well because you smoke cigarettes or, you know, you drink or you went to the dance hall, much of which, you know, couldn't be called into question. But, you know, segregation had a lot more to do with your the state of your life than failing the failures in those ways, you know.
Anything that people don't ask about your father and his legacy that they should, or anything that you just kind of want to share that, you know, maybe?
Yeah, the biggest thing, you know, some whites believe that my father was anti-white. Nothing could be further from the truth. You know, others believe that he came under the influence of outside agitators. I would say the principal agitator that he came under the influence of Vernon Johns, who was born and he was a Prince Edward native, and that, you know, the other thing is, you know, as he read and interpreted and understood the prophets, he believed that it was the work of the preacher to address issues of injustice. Now, having said that, there are certain things he wanted. My father believed deeply that all people should have an education, and he believed that, and he wanted his first goal was to achieve integrated schools in Prince Edward. But then once he did that, he wanted to push people to actually spend more money, not just on the Black student, but everybody. He believed that because of Longwood and Hamden sitting there, and because of some of the citizens in Prince Edward, it was uniquely situated to provide a high quality education. And one of his sayings was, especially after the space program, that we were being provided an ox cart education for a space age society, you know. So the biggest thing I want people to know is that he wanted the highest quality education for all the citizens of Prince Edward County. Second thing is he believed deeply in democracy. He would be, if he was 100 years old, which is somewhere near where he'd be a little bit older now, if he was still alive, he'd be out there fighting this thing about mail-in ballots. He believed in universal democracy. Now, I don't know where he would have come down on whether immigrants would be extended, you know, but you know, meaning immigrants who came here and haven't achieved citizenship. But I know in terms of Black, white, all of the people who are, you know, whose families go back and stuff, he would have felt that, yes, mail-in balloting, you know, he believed in democracy, democracy, democracy. And he believed in community. My grandmother fed people, Black, white, it didn't matter to her. And he believed that there should not be poor people. And he doesn't believe it would be unfair to say that he was, although Reverend Williams says he was you know, religious socialist. I would say that he didn't mind some people being rich, but he thought it was a sin that children would go hungry in America. He probably would have, I don't know where he would have been on health care, because that wasn't a big part of it, but he certainly thought it was a sin that children, he loved children, and the notion that children would go to bed without something to eat, or that they were hungry in America, or not having sufficient clothes, that really rubbed him the wrong way. So those kind of things, I would say, I want them to know. He certainly would have fought for programs to feed children. I remember once, you know, I made a comment, I'd learned a big word, and I think both he and my mother, and I said sort of offhandedly that somebody was an illegitimate child. Well, my mother and father didn't slap us much, but they both slapped me that day. And my mother's comment before my father could speak was, there's no such thing as an illegitimate child, there's illegitimate parents. and my mother would make clothes or redo our sister's clothes, or she would take food to families. They both believed deeply that it was just a shame in America that there would be children of any ethnicity that went hungry, you know. So that was what his commitment to the gospel was. The least of these, you know. Yeah.
So that kind of created another question, but sort of answered it too. I was going to kind of say, if we were the people who end up watching this, if they were to go out and kind of honor your parents' legacy, I mean, what kind of things could they do? But it sounds like, you know, donate to food banks and programs for children and things like that probably would be something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little worried. It would be interesting. I think my father would think that it was inappropriate to have monuments and statues to the Confederacy. I also think even, you know, and this may offend, I think he would think, let's not spend a lot of money on bronze and concrete statues, even ones honoring him. Let's spend the money on the living, you know. I remember Mr. Reed down at the funeral home, and my father were great friends, and he said, "Okay, Reed, now I know you're in the business, but remember what Jesus said: let the dead bury the dead," you know. And his thing was, you know, he was like, "Give me my monument while I'm alive." You know, I don't, you know, don't, you know, it's like you want to show that you're committed to people, help them while they're alive. You know, a young man or young woman trying to go to school, give them $25 toward their tuition, you know. You know, help, you know, if some older person wants to vote, drive them to the polls, you know, or an older person can't go out and, you know, she's living alone, the widow, you know, take them to the store, or even better, if they can't go to the store and take a bag of groceries to them. You know, that would, both my mother and father would say that you can't, and check in on them to see if they need something. The old fashioned church, you know, you need some groceries, you know, you need somebody to come around and clean the house. So that level too, not just let's march in the streets. Let's show our commitment to people while they're alive. Let's be concerned about our neighbor's welfare, you know. And by neighbor, he didn't mean the person living in your house. He meant any child of God, you know. I think as we enter this period, I think, you know, and I think one of the songs, "Let Us Break Bread Together on Our Knees," I think he would also say one of the failings of the world now is, you know, we don't take time to break bread together. He would probably say on our knees, but he would accept just breaking bread together, eating a meal, spending time. We spend too much time fighting with each other. And I will say this, and then I hope you can keep this part. You know, people question it. Otto Overton has said publicly that he and my father used to have lunch once a week in the church during the high point of the thing. He said, "I never convinced Reverend to come over to my point of view. He never convinced me, but we did have lunch and we had a better understanding of each other. And we were able to avoid some of the real problems that happen in other communities." And he's telling the truth. So he wasn't lying. He wasn't making it up. And it wasn't a question of trying to change Chief Overton, and it wasn't the question of trying to change my father. It was just a question of two men meeting over a meal, coming to appreciate each other as God's children. That they didn't ever come into total agreement and alignment, but they also avoided some of the real breakdowns that beset other communities. So breaking bread together is really, really important.